and we will be talking about food preservation. And something very important is that the questions will be held until the end of the session. And please write them in the Q&A section. Can you see the presentation? Yes, it's perfect. So go ahead. Fantastic. Thank you. So this afternoon, we will be talking a little bit about food security and preservation of food, because one thing goes hand in hand with the other. And it's very important that we are placed on the two topics that we will be working on in this presentation this afternoon. And first of all, let's start by giving you a definition of food security, because we talk a lot about this term, food security, but we don't go in depth about what food security means. And it's very important because when there is food security in our environments, countries, or states, and this is when all people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food. And there's several points here, and I will stop here because there's different elements in this definition. When all people have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe food. And when we talk about safe food, we mean food that is free of foodborne illnesses and that they're nutritious. Sometimes we can have physical access to the food, but we might not have the economic access to purchase it. And sometimes we have the opposite. Sometimes we do have economic access, but we do not have physical access to find the food. And sometimes we have the three things. We do not have physical or economic access, and that the food that we have is not safe or nutritious. So, in order to have food security, we need these three elements so that we can satisfy the needs and dietary preferences in order to have an active and healthy life. So we must take those three elements into account when we think if in our countries or our states or wherever we live rather, has food security. And this is something I would like you to meditate upon. Think about this element because sometimes we skip this. I know that many of you are in the farming business one way or the other, or you work with food per se. But it is important that everybody has that element of food security and awareness. I work with a lot of youths in Puerto Rico under the 4-H program, and I tell them because sometimes they think that food grows in the supermarket shelves, and that's not so. So we must make people be aware and understand that they must think about food security. And I think that there's a long way to go, at least in Puerto Rico, to attain this. Here on the screen in this slide, you can see some facts about food security on a global scale. It is estimated that in 2016, the number of chronically undernourished people increased to 815 million as compared to 2015. So in just 1 year, 815 million people, it's a very scary number. It's a very significant number. Even though, and I want to make that caveat and give you the fact that the figure is under the 900 million recorded in 2000. However, that reduction is not representative. I believe that we still have a long way to go so that we can reach a number where nobody in the world has food problems. And this is our goal. But I believe that 815 million is too much. We must do more. We must work harder and try to deal with this situation worldwide. Worldwide, there are different and multiple forms of malnutrition. And then there's the other extreme. There's obesity levels that are on the rise in most regions. And we see that in our regions. If we think about 20 or 30 years ago, and we start to look at ourselves, we don't have to compare ourselves to anybody. But if we assess ourselves, you might think, hey, I think that in the past 20 years, I have gained X amount of pounds. So that excess of weight and obesity has increased in all of our regions, and it actually has become a worldwide pandemic. So we must also take it into account because this is also part of food security. What food are we producing? What are we consuming that is leading to this overweight and obesity worldwide? So not only do we have undernourishment, malnutrition, and chronic malnutrition, but also excess weight and obesity. And now let's talk in general terms about some dimensions of food security. And it is very important that we take into account these elements when talking about food security. And the first dimension that we must think about is availability. Let's ask ourselves, are there sufficient quantities of food supplied through domestic production or imports? So we have to see the food availability, if it's enough, is it quality products, is it adequate, and is it supplied through all of the production rather in that country? Because sometimes we see certain countries that produce a lot of countries in a geographic area, let's say north and west, but perhaps that country in the southeast has a deficit in production or the quality is not optimal. So we have to consider the availability element because this is one of the dimensions of food security. And I would like to pose a question to you, particularly to the Puerto Ricans, which is where I live geographically, and you are the people that I work with every day. Let us think, where does the food that we eat come from and how does it get into our homes? Many days we ask ourselves, and especially when we go to the supermarket, sometimes we wonder why there is less food and we spend more money. Well, this is something you must ask yourselves because it depends where our food comes from and how it comes to our homes. So each time there is a greater cost to buy the same items. And I know that this is not exclusive of Puerto Rico. I know that everybody represented here from different countries and states, you all are facing some challenges to purchase these food items. And in the map, I'm giving you an example. I'm just putting a point of the existing situation in Puerto Rico and trying to give you an example. In Puerto Rico, we only produce less than 20% of the food that we consume. And the rest of the 80% comes from all those dots that you see on the map. We buy from all around the world. Why? Because we do not produce enough to feed our people. So, your homework today is to take this fact that we only produce 20% of the food that we consume. So there's still a long way to go for food security in our country. And I'm sure that in many of your countries, you have a similar situation. And perhaps what might change is the percentages. But I am sure that you will have the similar problem that you don't produce enough food to supply it to all of the people who live and reside in your geographical areas. Therefore, we must work much more. We must analyze this data and think that there's still a long way to go in order to achieve food security. And this is what we need in the places where we are geographically. And you can see the map. And if you look at it, we are in a global world where we buy from everybody what we don't have. But when there are situations such as what's happening right now, such as a pandemic, climate change, natural events, natural disasters, war zone conflicts, then there's a problem. Because if I don't produce the food and I buy it from others, and these others have problems producing or shipping the products, then I will have a food security problem in my country because everything that I purchase abroad will lack. In Puerto Rico, we buy 80% of the food that we buy. So imagine the serious problem that we have to produce enough. And here, I will give you another example so that you have an idea of why we continue paying more and more for the food. Well, this is because for the food to arrive to the Caribbean and the areas where we live, it has to go through many, many nautical miles. And these nautical miles are translated into money because to move all of that food throughout all of that trajectory, it has to, it involves paying employees, diesel, ports, export, import taxes, and all of this costs, and it costs more each time. Therefore, this cost will be translated and added on to the food that we produce. If we had internal production in Puerto Rico, and territorially we're not big enough, then we would not have to go so many miles to access this food. Therefore, we would not be paying the prices that we're paying for the food right now. And in addition, we would have fresh products because you can see in this map that there's some areas where it tells you that it takes 25 days, 9,600 nautical miles to go from point X that sold the product to arrive to the Caribbean and deliver the food. And the same thing happens if we go to the other side of the world on the left. We have another 29-day trip where it takes 10,627 miles. And this is coming from Europe. And we could go on and on the whole day speaking about the nautical miles that our food has to go in order to arrive to the Caribbean. So this map is just to give you a perspective of why we have to work with food security, because the food is going too long, too many nautical miles, too many days, and it could be complicated with events that are happening simultaneously worldwide. And therefore, the availability is in a question mark of how available food is if there is some sort of event and we cannot go across the seas.
And now let's see another aspect of food security. which is accessibility. What is the accessibility to that food? Other data on Puerto Rico that will allow us to get a general picture is that 58% of the population in Puerto Rico has access to food through government benefits such as food stamps, week and school canteens as other examples. More than half of our population are fed through government benefits. So were the government not to grant these benefits, it begs a question, how are people going to feed themselves? So the accessibility aspect of food security presents us with a situation that requires work. I encourage you to look for these statistics in your regions to find out how many people receive government benefits that allow them to feed themselves. In 2012, food prices in Puerto Rico were 23% higher than in the United States, while our income was 63% lower. So you can see what is the accessibility that we have to our foods. Maybe it's happening in your own countries. This is something that is happening worldwide, the issue with accessibility. When we go to the supermarket, we can hear everybody complaining about the prices, that everything is consistently more expensive, that we need to spend more. And in 2018, we can see that 1.2 million people in Puerto Rico benefited from the Nutritional Assistance Program. That represents a 36.3% of our population. So these are alarming data. And we can see that accessibility to our food is not what we would think, that food is accessible and that everybody could have the income to feed themselves. Another aspect about food security is the adequacy of food. Drinking water, health, medical attention is something that is necessary to attain a state of nutritional well-being in which all human needs are met. How nutritious are the foods that we eat? That is something that we also need to highlight. And poor nutrition has caused many health-related problems related to the consumption of non-nutritious foods. We have substituted our farms and our products with products that are chemically and prepared and processed in the industry, which do not necessarily come from our land, but that are created chemically in labs. These have caused a great deal of health issues because we are consuming too many non-nutritious foods. And this is creating a situation of with obesity, malnutrition, and many chronic conditions that we didn't see before, because at those times we had foods that came from the land and from what we harvested. So we need to continue emphasizing that we need to have our community gardens, we need to have our school gardens, and we need to plant so that we can work on food supplies. We also have the system stability. It relates to the risks that could affect the production, distribution, and vulnerability of food supply chains. We have a food supply chain, you have the producers of foods, but you also have to think of those who transport it, packaging, manufacturing, transportation to the supermarket, to the pharmacy, to the bread shop, and how we can have access to them. Whenever we have events such as a maritime accident, that stability of the systems is affected, as I mentioned before, and we have some examples here, but there are many more. Here we had a crash of ships in Mumbai, and closer to the Caribbean, we had the sinking of El Faro ship that was coming from Jacksonville to Puerto Rico. It happened on October 1st of 2015. These ships were carrying foods and they were not able to reach their destinations. This affected our systems because these are foods that never reached our shores, and there's a coordination for that movement. So if the ship sinks and you lose all of that food and the ships didn't make it to shore, obviously, we will have a delay of a month, 2-3 months for that food to come, maybe more. Some other factors that affect our system of distribution is climate change. We will mention just a few. We have increases in temperature, changes in rainfall patterns, melting glaciers, sea level rise, pests and diseases, coral bleaching, increases in intensity and frequency of extreme weather events. How does this affect us? We have some pictures here. There will be many situations related to climate change that will not allow us to produce our foods in the manner that we are accustomed to, because extreme climate events can bring a lot of heat, can bring droughts, can bring storms, hurricanes, and affect our maritime routes, causing our foods not to reach us. Floods could also happen. Many other events that affect us at sea, fish, the possibility to have access to that type of food. We also have losses, and you have the loss of coastlines. It affects the plants and the animals and how that food chain happens so that we can feed ourselves. So all of these climate changes have an effect on the food distribution chain, and perhaps what we were able to get every 2 weeks, it might take 6 months to arrive because production was affected. We also have the pandemic. I mentioned diseases. It could be due to plagues or pandemic diseases, and this is just happening. We've been working with this situation of COVID-19 for about 2 years. Manufacturing plants had to be closed, and pretty much all of the systems had to be paralyzed. And this is a country that does not have food security. And as such, all these closings will affect it. And I know that you saw it elsewhere throughout the world and in the Caribbean. We would go to the supermarket to find some products that we couldn't find. And nowadays, to date, we still have products that we cannot find because production has started, but not at the speed that we're used to. So it'll take some more time. If more variants come up, we will have a longer waiting period for this distribution chain to stabilize. So in this initial presentation that I wanted to do as a kind of introduction. You have to decide if it's safe, if it's nutritious, everything that can have an effect on our distribution chain. You have to evaluate whether or not we actually have food security in the Caribbean. I believe that we still have a lot of work to do to attain that. So entities such as the one that is collaborating with us today work on that. And many of you, if you're here today, you're here because you work with that, or you are concerned, or you want to contribute something to food security. So it is important for you to take away the issue of food security and how you can make a contribution for it to improve. So that was my purpose in presenting you with these data. Now we will look at the role of food preservation in food security. How it can be one of the roles that we want to look at today. How we can contribute to food security. If we work with the concept of food preservation or conservation, perhaps we can prepare ahead of time before events occur, and then we can have food available for these historical events. What is food preservation or conservation? It's the set of procedures and resources that we will use to prepare and package food products with the purpose of storing them and consuming them long after they have been preserved. I will have this food stored away for a long time. It can be stored, and then we can consume it at a given point in time when it's needed. It's important that long after preserving them, their organoleptic characteristics and nutritional properties are still untouched, because we feed ourselves through the eyes as well as the mouth. We like the taste, but we first smell and see the food. If we don't like the color, if we don't like the smell, we will not consume it. So it's important in this process of food preservation and conservation to look at how to extend that period of time that will allow us to transport it and display it at a business where the consumer can buy it and finally consume it. That is what we look for in food preservation and conservation. And it's not only an industry issue. We can do it in the community, in the family. We cannot depend completely on the government. We have to contribute from our own family. If everybody in the family procures their food, we don't have great problems, because we have been able to solve the problem. And then thinking at the community level, once we have made sure that our families have an adequate level of food, then we will work with the communities, and then the communities will work with their municipalities and their countries, and so on. That's how we will build this network of support in the Caribbean and in different parts of the world, where we can support each other. This image defines somehow the organoleptic aspect. And by that, I refer to the 5 senses. In the prior definition, I said that they need to preserve their organoleptic characteristics and nutritional properties. So when I talk about organoleptic properties, I refer to the conservation of the sound. If I'm used to chewing a pork rind and hearing the crunch sound, it continues to be crunchy. I cannot preserve it, but then lose the crunch, because then I will say, you know what, this is not good, this is stale, and I don't want to eat it. The smell, as I mentioned before, we eat through our eyes and our scent first. So the texture, the color, the aspect, the smell of that food, it needs to be preserved. It needs to keep that appearance that it had before it was preserved, when it was still fresh. So it's important for the food to maintain those characteristics so that the flavor, the smell, the texture doesn't change. Here, I would like to talk about foodborne illnesses in general terms, because food preservation can be interrupted by foodborne illnesses, which can cause infections or intoxication. When we talk about infectious foodborne illnesses, they can be produced by the ingestion of foods that contain live microorganisms that are harmful to health, such as viruses, bacteria, and parasites, E. coli, Salmonella, Listeria. These are all examples. When we talk about intoxication, we refer to the ingestion of toxins or poisons that are present in this ingested food, which are produced by fungi or bacteria, even though they're no longer in the food. So they leave some toxins or poisons that will make us sick when we consume the food. An example of this is the botulinum toxin or the staphylococcus toxin. So it's important for us to keep in mind that we will preserve foods, preventing that these diseases are produced. That is the most important thing to keep in mind, because it's no use to preserve foods inadequately in a manner in which these diseases can be transmitted by this food that are preserved. So it's important to choose a method that is adequate, to know the procedure, that the equipment used is the adequate one to prevent foodborne illnesses. Why use adequate methods to preserve? They eliminate microorganisms and enzymes. It inhibits the growth of microorganisms in the food. It inactivates the microorganisms and enzymes that cause alterations. And because they protect by using containers that avoid recontamination and reduce factors of mechanical, physical, or chemical alteration. It is important for that physical and chemical aspect of the food that we know them, because that will allow us to choose the method that we will use with that product. That's how we decide what kind of container, what cost, and what method of distribution will be used for that product in particular. Now we will talk about food spoilage factors in general. And something that I wanted to mention before we go into the factors as such are two important factors. And I'm going to talk in general terms because this would require an entire course, but something that I want you to take away with you today is that the chemical composition of the food can be affected or altered by water and acidity. So it's very important for us to assess, consider, and know what is the water contents and the level of moisture of the food at the time of choosing the method used for preservation. It is important for the food. It is important that we know what is the water contents and the moisture level of the food, because the less water, the less a chance of spoiling through microorganisms. The other aspect is acidity, and when we talk about acidity in general terms, we use it, we measure it with a pH scale, and that scale goes from 0 to 14. 7 is a neutral on that scale, and the acids will be under 7, and the alkalines are going to be above 7. In the industry, we use the measure of 4.6 pH, which is an acid level. And when we fall below 4.6, that's what we consider an acid food. And we use it to avoid the production of toxins, specifically Clostridium botulinum, which is highly lethal. So instead of using 7, which is what we normally would use in the pH scale as neutral, for food preservation, we will work with a measure of 4.6 or less in order to consider it acid, and 4.6 and above to consider something alkaline when we choose the type of method that we will use to preserve food. And here there are some factors besides water and moisture and pH. We have microorganisms and bacteria, molds, and yeasts. They can spoil our foods, and if we don't use the correct methods, we will not eliminate them, and we will not take them out of the equation.
Another element that we can use is enzymatic activity, and these proteins can accelerate the chemical processes. They can be destroyed with heat, they can affect the pH, and some prefer acidic environments, and others, depending on the enzyme that we're working with. And many times they are responsible for changes in colors and decomposed smell. Here you can see a picture that illustrates it. For example, the half of the apple is white, the way we're used to. But if you look at the darker color, and if you see it, you're going to say, no, this is decomposed, it's no good. And it's like a flag that tells you something's going on. And what's going on is an enzymatic change in the food. And obviously, if we cut that part off and eat the rest, it's in a good shape. But just by the looks of it, we throw it out. We say that it's bad. However, when you look at the bananas on the left, you might think, they're still a little green. They're not ripe enough. They're halfway ripe. So let's wait until we see those dark dots and they are more ripe to eat them. And what I mean to say is that the enzymatic activity can go against or for the food. Some things we think they're good because we like the food that way, but others might tell us that the food is not good or deteriorated. Also, chemical reactions such as the Maillard reaction or rancidity could be elements that affect food preservation, and it might also affect the way we consume the food. As part of the Maillard oxidation, we talk about reactions produced between proteins and sugars in the food at high temperatures, and they generate a color and a taste and a smell that's kind of toasted or smoky. For example, when we barbecue, that particular color and smell that we like when we barbecue meats, It's because of the Maillard reaction. Same thing happens when we toast bread. We cannot think about a pound of bread that's just out of the oven that doesn't have that golden color, right? If it's white or pale, we say, hey, this bread is not cooked enough. So that color and that smell and that taste of toast is is caused by the Maillard reaction. And this we see as something positive. Now, when we talk about rancidity, it's when fat and protein react with oxygen. And in the picture on the slide, you can see some food that may become rancid. It could be the avocado, fish, perhaps the nuts, seeds, hazelnuts, the oil. There has to be some fat, some high level of fat that reacts with the oxygen, fat and protein reacting with oxygen. All right, so now let's talk in general terms without going into many details because each point is a full course or a class. But I just wanted to give you an idea of some of the methods that we can use for food preservation. And the first group is cold preservation. For example, the first group is refrigeration. And I believe that this is what we know the most because it's something that we do automatically. Nobody had to teach us, although previous generations had to learn it. But we do know that certain foods have to go in the fridge. So potentially dangerous foods are what? Those that have a higher pH of 4.6 and those that have a water activity that's point 0.85 or higher. And this is what should be maintained in the refrigerator or that they will be kept in 40 degrees Fahrenheit or less without reaching the freezing point. Because when we move to freezing, then it's a different temperature that that food must have and the temperature to conserve foods. So, what do we want from the refrigeration? It's to reduce the speed of chemical reactions in food so that the microorganism, I don't want to say that they won't grow, they will grow, but at a slower pace. Some examples of what we must refrigerate, and I believe that this is really easy because it's kind of automatic, it's routine for us. Meats, poultry, milk, eggs, dairy products, any product that has eggs, seafood, all of that must be refrigerated. Second point is freezing in this larger group. And in freezing, we will submit the products to temperatures lower than 20 degrees Fahrenheit, and the time of freezing will be more reduced. So, what do we want with freezing? Well, it provokes that the part of the water of the food becomes ice and it stops the growth of bacteria. So, what we want is to stop this growth. But something very important, and I always explain it, we do not kill bacteria in the freezer. What was already there, it's still there, it's just dormant. So what we want is that the bacteria does not multiply, but the bacteria that was already present will not go away. And it's important that the freezing happens in the least time possible so that the food preserves color, texture, and taste so that the organoleptic characteristics are preserved. This is what we want with freezing. And when we go to the deep freeze, the temperature changes a little bit. We can go from less 31 degrees Fahrenheit to less 238 degrees Fahrenheit. And obviously, this is done with very specialized equipment. And the process is even faster than in freezing because we have smaller ice crystals than in freezing. Why? So that the food tissue is not affected. We stop bacteria from multiplying, and we do not affect the texture, the tissue of the food. It's bruised or harmed. So these are the food preservation methods with cold. Then we have heat preservation. And when we speak about heat presentation, obviously the first is cooking. And this is very common because we do this every day. And we want the food to reach 212 Fahrenheit degrees in cooking. And therefore, we will eliminate most of the microorganisms. But something important is that in cooking, we do not eliminate spores, they're still present. So, something that is very important in the cooking method is that what we're doing while cooking is to make the food easier to digest so that we can consume it. The second point of this method is blanching. And this is something that stops the enzymatic processing or process. We want blanching to stop enzymes. And these enzymes are responsible for the growth and mature and ripening of fruits and vegetables. This method is usually accompanied by another one. Most methods are accompanied by another, but blanching is usually combined with freezing or dehydrating. It's kind of like a pre treatment before you use another preservation method. And something that we also seek is to conserve the organoleptic characteristics of the food, particularly the nutritional value, so that it's not lost through freezing or dehydration or any other method that we combine it with. Pasteurization is another method that's done with heat for a short time to destroy microorganisms, and so that taste or color are not affected in the food. We use it for working, and you can see the chart. We use it in products such as milk, juice, eggs, and I'm sharing here the temperature and time. If you notice, most of them are seconds. For example, milk, it's put in 145 Fahrenheit degrees, it's 30 minutes. But in 161 degrees Fahrenheit, you only need 15 seconds. And if you add a little bit more temperature, 280 Fahrenheit, is just in 2 seconds. It's done. And what we want is to eliminate bacteria from the product, but we do not want to expose it to the heat for a long time so that the product is not affected. Then we have sterilization, which is when we submit it to over 400 Fahrenheit degrees, and we eliminate microorganisms. But with sterilization, the important thing is that we eliminate the spores of the food. Something very important is that this method is used more often when we want to have sterile commercial food or food that is stable for the shelves in supermarkets. These are food that's preserved in glass, plastic, or metal so that it doesn't spoil while they're in the container in the supermarket shelves or wherever it is that they're being sold. And the last heat preservation method is uperization at UHT, and it goes to 140 Celsius degrees to 284 Fahrenheit, but for small amount of time. 2 seconds. 2 seconds is enough to kill all microorganisms and spores, and therefore we can maintain the food as stable as possible without refrigeration. And I give you the example of the UHT milk that comes in boxes. It's exposed for 2 seconds to this high temperatures, eliminating microorganisms and spores, and then it can be put in the containers so that they have a long shelf life without being refrigerated. And once we open them, then we do have to refrigerate. The third food preservation method is the chemical preservation, and it consists of adding substances that can chemically modify the food. For example, salting or brining, and we add salt to preserve the food and avoid the growth of microorganisms. We may also add sugar. Some concentrations of sugar in the food do not allow microorganisms to grow. And remember the concept of humidity, water, or pH. We will be playing with this chemical conservation by adding chemicals, but also playing with maintaining the 4.6 or less in that food and not to go over 0.85 in terms of humidity. And this is what we want with chemical preservation. There's also cured methods where we use common salt, or you can use nitrates or potassium or sodium nitrates that are used for these procedures. And it helps us to keep the pink or red color in the meats. In smoking, the smoked preservation, the smoke combusts with the resin and gives an aroma, gives a peculiar taste to fish and meats that we like so much. And then this is also very enjoyable when we eat the food, when we smell it or taste it. Acidification also includes adding an acid product, which could be citric acid, vinegar. And why do we do it? So that the fruits and vegetables can be preserved in a way that they will not have microorganisms growing. The acidification many times is accompanied by fermentation because there are certain foods that must ferment. They have the acidification, but they need to be fermented in order to be stable. But fermented foods could also be a different group where the 4.6 pH groups are put in a salt solution, which is a brine, and so that the bacteria be, can make the carbohydrates become acid, and then it's stable. I could give you an example of the sauerkraut that we use it in our traditional foods. We use sauerkraut quite a bit. Another example of non-fermented foods, but which are acidified, are beets and cucumbers or pickles that we can use the acid method, but they're not necessarily fermented. The fourth method, we're talking about dehydration, where there's a removal of moisture to prevent the growth of bacteria and fungi. And there's some methods that we can use, and I will show you on the screen. We have the method of an electric or household dehydrator, something that we use in our homes. We could have a solar dehydrator, and you can see in the map there's many things that we can find in the internet to buy. We could use a conventional oven in our houses, but you must evaluate the energy cost by the consumption of gas or electricity, because you have to leave the oven a little bit open, and then some of the heat will escape, and there's a high consumption of gas or electricity depending on how much you use it. You could also use dehydrating in the sun, but as you can see in the picture, you must cover the food. You have to have food safety so that the food is not contaminated. It could be done in the air, as you can see the spices in a rack that you can hang with string. And there's also a dehydration method in the plant itself. For example, if I'm not going to use all of the banana, why cut the full bunch? What I do is I go and cut 4 or 5 bananas that I need and then leave the rest of the bunch on the tree. Here you can see also an example of sunflower seeds. The seeds are there, and I could leave them finish their process, and then I can store them so that I can cultivate other seeds. Same thing with corn. There's an example on the screen that it's left on the plant itself, and then we just use what we need from the food. Um, Method number 5 for food preservation is home canning and or vacuum. And this is divided in 2 big groups. Acidic foods, which could be used in a pot of boiling water, and whatever you have, as long as the containers fit and it will reach 212 degrees Fahrenheit in the boiling point, or non-acidic foods where you would use a pressure cooker. And if you can see the picture on the screen to your right, you'll see what I'm talking about. This cooker has a clock. It's not a traditional pressure cooker that we use in our homes. This pot has a clock or some weights in order to measure the pressure in which the food will be exposed, because it must reach 240 degrees Fahrenheit. And in our traditional pressure cooker, we cannot measure the pressure to see if we reached the 240 degrees Fahrenheit. And what were we looking? With this, what we want is to destroy the spores, Clostridium botulinum, because they're problematic.
This is the English interpreter. If we do not use the correct equipment, the right equipment with the right food, we might leave some spores of microorganisms in that food. And at the time of consuming the food, we could become sick or even die. The last method of food preservation that we will speak about, that we'll talk about, is dry food preservation. Some people call it pails of food, but that is just a way of storing it or carrying it that is easier. But what's important here are mylar bags and oxygen absorbers. The size of these oxygen absorbers will correspond to the size of the mylar bags that need to be sealed in order to preserve foods easily for 15 to 20 years. We can also use recycled containers, such as the ones that we have on the screen. What's important about using recycled containers is that they were used previously for food. They cannot be containers that contained anything other than food. And you must make sure that the container bears the PETE1 label, because that is the thickest plastic that will not allow the penetration of oxygen, which will allow us to preserve that food free of moisture for the longest. These are some examples of preservation methods. We could talk endlessly about each one of them and giving you recipes, but what are the benefits of food preservation? It rids the food of pathogenic microorganisms It doesn't allow foreign substances to enter the food, causing the product to lose its fresh quality. It reduces or avoids the use of chemical preservatives. Because we're using fresh products, there's no need to use so many chemicals as is customary in the food industry. They have different standards and they want food to last way longer, so they require some chemical products to preserve them for a longer time. It also helps us to benefit the environment. We avoid food waste. Worldwide, the amount of food that is wasted is absurd. So with food preservation, we avoid food waste. Most do not need refrigeration. They can be kept at room temperature, so you do not need power consuming equipment. That helps the environment. And we also save money. You use vegetable and/or fruit parts that are usually disposed of or composted. So that means that there's less domestic waste that reaches the bodies of water in the Caribbean or the landfills. So this will benefit both the environment and our families. Some other benefits of food preservation are the availability of varied fruit throughout the year. Sometimes we have a lot of mangoes and we have so many mangoes in season that nobody wants them, even if you give them away. Later in the year, we would give an arm and a leg for a mango. So if you preserve food, you will have that food throughout the year. The same thing happens with breadfruit and other seasonal fruits. If you preserve them, you will have them throughout the year. Plus, they're not wasted. They can be stored for long periods of time. They're prepared in advance. And that is a big plus when it comes to food security, because I will have stored foods that will be available in case something happens. They're ready to eat because most of these preservation methods allow you to open the container and the food will be ready to eat. They also extend the crop's shelf life. And it diversifies income sources. You can save in some areas so that you can spend in others, or you can save, or you can use all of that for other needs.